Single Dad's CEO refused to attend Christmas blind date until she stepped in and stole his heart. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Snow fell soft and quiet on the streets of Boston that Christmas Eve, blanketing everything in white while twinkling lights wrapped around lampposts and carols drifted from open shop doors like warm invitations to come inside and forget your troubles. Rosewood Cafe sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, its windows glowing golden against the winter dark. And inside, families laughed over hot chocolate, while couples held hands across candlelit tables, celebrating the magic of the season. One table near the frosted window sat empty with a single red rose in a slim vase, and a reserved sign that had been there for over an hour. And behind the counter, a young woman with tired eyes and flour, still dusted on her apron, watched the door like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. She didn't know that the man who was about to walk through that door would change her life forever. And he didn't know that the blind date he was desperate to skip would lead him to the love he thought he'd buried 2 years ago. Bennett Crawford sat in his Mercedes outside the cafe with the engine still running, and his 6-year-old daughter Nola bouncing in her booster seat, pointing at every Christmas decoration she could see through the window. "Daddy, look at the lights. They're so pretty. Can we go inside now? Please, please, please." But Bennett couldn't move, couldn't make himself open the door and walk into another disaster his mother had arranged because she couldn't accept that he wasn't ready to replace Grace. Might never be ready, and every blind date felt like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor that read, "Victoria Ashford is on her way. She's the daughter of Senator Ashford. Don't you dare embarrass me by leaving early this time." And Bennett wanted to throw the phone out the window, except it cost more than some people's monthly rent, and that would be a waste. He'd canceled the last 7 blind dates his mother had arranged, walked out of 3 others before the appetizers arrived, and developed a reputation in Boston's elite circles as the grieving widower who couldn't move on, which was accurate, but still annoying to hear whispered at charity galas. Nola's small voice cut through his spiral of dread. "Daddy, why do you always look sad? You used to smile, but now you just look tired all the time." The words hit him like a punch to the chest because his little girl shouldn't have to notice things like that, shouldn't have to carry the weight of his grief on her tiny shoulders. He turned around to look at her, this perfect combination of him and Grace with her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin, and forced a smile that felt like cracking ice. "I'm not sad, pumpkin. Just thinking about grown-up stuff." Nola tilted her head the way Grace used to when she knew he was lying, and said, "Mommy used to say tired and sad are the same thing sometimes. Is that true, Daddy?" Bennett's throat closed up because 2 years later, and it still felt like yesterday, still felt like any moment Grace would walk through the door, laughing about traffic and apologizing for being late. But she wasn't coming back, would never come back, and the drunk driver who ran that red light had taken everything from them in one terrible instant. He took a breath and unbuckled his seatbelt because Nola wanted to see the pretty cafe with the Christmas lights, and he could at least give her that. Could sit for 10 minutes and drink coffee and then claim she was tired and needed to go home before Victoria Ashford arrived, expecting conversation and connection he didn't have the energy to fake. "Okay, sweetheart, let's go inside and get you some hot chocolate." And Nola cheered so loud he almost smiled for real. Wren Holloway had been working since 6 in the morning, and her feet were screaming, and her back ached from carrying trays, and her smile felt permanently glued to her face, even though inside she was running on fumes and sheer stubbornness. Mrs. Penny, the cafe owner, kept trying to make her take a break, but breaks didn't pay rent, and rent was due in 5 days, and Wren was exactly $47 short of making it happen. She wiped down the counter for the 100th time and watched happy families enjoy their Christmas Eve while she pretended she wasn't lonely, pretended she had somewhere to be after her shift ended, pretended this was fine. The door opened and cold air rushed in, along with a man in an expensive coat that probably cost more than her monthly salary, and a little girl in a red Christmas dress who immediately started pointing at everything and asking questions at approximately 1 million words per minute. Wren grabbed 2 menus and walked over, her customer service smile sliding into place, like armor she'd worn so long it felt like skin. "Hi there, table for 2?" The man barely looked at her, distracted and tense. his jaw tight like he was bracing for something unpleasant. Actually, I have a reservation, Crawford. Wren checked the book and found the name, led them to table 7 with the rose and the candle, and handed over menus while the little girl climbed into the booth and immediately grabbed the crayons Wren had left there for exactly this purpose. She pulled out her notepad and asked what she could get them to drink, and the man said coffee, black, in a voice that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. But the little girl looked up with huge brown eyes and said, "Can I have hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, please? And also, what's your name, because I'm Nola, and I'm 6, and I like your earrings." All in one breath, and Wren felt something warm crack through the exhaustion in her chest. "I'm Wren, and I love your dress, Nola. You look like a Christmas princess." Nola giggled and said, "I'm not a princess. I'm a dinosaur expert. T-Rexes are my favorite, even though their arms are really small." And Wren laughed for real, the first genuine laugh she'd had all day. She caught the man watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between surprise and curiosity, before he looked back down at his phone. 20 minutes passed and the other chair stayed empty while Bennett checked his watch and checked his phone and tried to ignore the hope building in his chest that maybe Victoria wouldn't show up after all. His mother texted that she was stuck in traffic, then that she was almost there, then nothing for 15 minutes, and Bennett started to think the universe might actually be on his side for once. Nola was coloring on her napkin and chattering about dinosaurs, and occasionally asking when the lady was coming. And Bennett kept giving vague answers because he didn't know how to explain that Daddy was praying the lady got a flat tire. Finally, his phone rang, and Victoria's voice came through, apologetic and rushed, explaining that a friend was having an emergency and she had to cancel, and could they reschedule through his mother. Bennett agreed immediately, hung up before she could change her mind, and felt relief flood through him so strong he almost laughed out loud. "The lady isn't coming, Pumpkin. It's just us tonight." And Nola cheered like he'd just announced they were going to Disney World. Wren came back with refills, and Nola immediately launched into a detailed explanation of why velociraptors were actually the smartest dinosaurs, and Wren listened like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard, asking questions and making impressed sounds in all the right places. Bennett watched this waitress crouch down to his daughter's level and give her full attention like Nola was the most important person in the room, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 2 years started to thaw just slightly. Then Nola's face crumpled without warning, and she said, "I wish Mommy was here. She loved Christmas. Why did she have to go to heaven, Daddy?" And Bennett felt his heart shatter all over again because he still didn't have answers. Still didn't know how to explain death to a 6-year-old who just wanted her mother back. He pulled her close and held her while she cried, and Wren stood there uncertain whether to leave or stay. But then Wren did something that stopped Bennett's breath. She knelt down beside Nola and said softly, "Hey, sweetie, I know it hurts. My mommy's in heaven too." Nola looked up with wet eyes, and Wren continued, "You know what my grandmother told me? She said people we love never really leave us. They become stars that watch over us every night. So every time you see a star, that's your mommy saying hi." Nola's face transformed from devastation to wonder. "Really? Mommy is a star?" Wren nodded, and Nola turned to Bennett, grabbing his arm. "Daddy, did you hear that? Mommy is watching us from a star. We have to look for her tonight." Bennett couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stare at this stranger who had just given his daughter more comfort in 30 seconds than a year of expensive therapy had managed. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice rough. "For saying that." Wren stood up, looking almost embarrassed. "It's nothing. My mom passed when I was young. It's just something that helped me." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared grief. Understanding that didn't need words. Bennett said, "I'm sorry for your loss," and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. The cafe was emptying out as families headed home to hang stockings and leave cookies for Santa, and Mrs. Penny started dimming lights and wiping down tables with pointed looks at the clock. Bennett realized he didn't want to leave, didn't want to go back to his empty mansion where the silence echoed and every room reminded him of Grace. And before he could stop himself, he asked Wren if she ever got a break. She blinked at him confused, and he fumbled through an explanation that his date had canceled and his daughter seemed to like her. And honestly, she was the first person who'd made him feel human in months, and would she maybe sit with them for a few minutes? Mrs. Penny yelled from behind the counter, "Wren, take your break already before I make it in order." And Nola looked up hopefully, and Wren found herself sliding into the booth across from them without quite deciding to. Bennett smiled at her, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look 10 years younger, and said, "I'm Bennett, properly this time, and you already know this dinosaur expert." Nola waved her crayon imperiously and said, "Miss Wren, did you know T-Rexes couldn't clap because their arms were too short? It's very sad for them." Wren laughed and caught Bennett's eye across the table, and neither of them looked away for a long moment while the snow fell outside, and Christmas Eve wrapped around them like a promise of something neither of them had expected to find. They talked until Mrs. Penny had to physically shoo them out the door because she had a granddaughter waiting at home and a turkey that wasn't going to cook itself. And even then, Bennett found himself lingering on the sidewalk outside the cafe, not wanting the night to end. Nola was half asleep against his shoulder, mumbling about stars and dinosaurs, and Wren stood in the doorway with her coat pulled tight against the cold, looking like she didn't want to say goodbye either. Bennett shifted Nola's weight and pulled out a business card, handing it to Wren with fingers that felt clumsy and uncertain in a way they hadn't since he was a teenager asking a girl to prom. "In case you ever want to talk, or have coffee, or teach Nola more dinosaur facts." And Wren took the card and glanced at it, and her eyes went wide because apparently she hadn't put the pieces together until now. "Bennett Crawford, Crawford Industries. You're that Bennett Crawford?" Her voice pitched up in a way that made him wince because he knew what came next, the shift in how people treated him once they realized he could buy the building they were standing in without checking his bank account. But Wren just laughed and shook her head. "I spent 2 hours complaining about my rent to a billionaire. That's absolutely humiliating." Bennett found himself smiling for real. "I liked hearing about your life. It's more interesting than board meetings and quarterly reports." Wren looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he was serious, and whatever she saw in his face must have convinced her, because she smiled back and said, "Good night, Bennett Crawford," in a voice that made his name sound like something worth keeping. The days after Christmas were filled with texts that started casual and quickly became the thing Bennett looked forward to most. His phone lighting up with photos of Wren's latest baking experiments and stories about difficult customers and jokes that made him laugh out loud in the middle of meetings. He sent her pictures of Nola's drawings, which now all featured a stick figure labeled Miss Wren standing next to their family, and didn't examine too closely what that meant. They talked on the phone late at night after Nola was asleep, conversations that stretched for hours about everything and nothing, about dreams and disappointments and the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't really see you. Bennett told her about the pressure of running a company everyone expected him to run perfectly, and Wren told him about the bakery she dreamed of opening someday if she could ever save enough money. He hadn't felt this connected to another person since Grace, and that thought terrified him as much as it thrilled him. Their first real date was at a quiet Italian place Wren had chosen specifically because it wasn't fancy, and she'd made him promise no restaurants where the waiters wore tuxedos. They shared a bottle of wine and talked until the candles burned down to stubs, and somewhere between the appetizers and dessert, Bennett told her about Grace in a way he'd never told anyone. She was driving home from picking up Nola's birthday cake when a drunk driver ran a red light. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't, and Wren reached across the table and held them without saying anything. "I was at the office. I'm always at the office. I should have picked it up myself, but I had a meeting I thought was more important." The guilt poured out of him like poison he'd been holding too long, and Wren listened without trying to fix it or minimize it. "You can't blame yourself for someone else's terrible choice," she said finally, and Bennett shook his head because he'd heard that 100 times from therapists and friends and family. But then Wren added, "You're here now, with me, and that means you're trying, and trying is all any of us can do." And something about the simplicity of it cracked through walls he'd built so carefully. Nola fell in love with Wren faster than Bennett did, which was saying something because Bennett was falling pretty hard. Wren started coming over to help with homework and ended up staying for dinner, started dropping by for coffee, and ended up baking cookies with Nola for 3 hours while Bennett watched from the doorway, feeling like his heart might actually explode. His daughter looked at Ren like she hung the moon, and Ren looked at Nola like she was the most precious thing in the world. One afternoon, Nola tugged on Ren's sleeve and asked very seriously, "Miss Ren, do you want to be my friend forever?" And Ren's eyes got suspiciously shiny as she said, "I'd love that, sweetheart." Then Nola added with the devastating honesty of children, "Could you maybe be more than a friend? Because Daddy smiles when you're here, and he never smiles anymore." And Ren hugged her so tight Bennett had to leave the room before anyone saw him cry. Everything was perfect until Eleanor Crawford decided it wasn't, because Bennett's mother had opinions about everything, and sharing them was her favorite hobby. She showed up at his office unannounced with her lips pressed into a thin line and her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a warning. "A waitress? This is who you're wasting your time with, while Victoria Ashford waits for you to come to your senses?" Eleanor's voice dripped with the kind of disdain she usually reserved for politicians and bad wine. Bennett felt his jaw tighten. "I'm not wasting anything, Mother." Eleanor waved a manicured hand. "She's after your money. They always are. And you're too grief-stricken to see it." Bennett stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "She didn't know who I was when she was kind to Nola. She didn't know I had money when she made me laugh for the first time in 2 years. And I won't let you reduce her to some gold digger stereotype because she doesn't fit your idea of acceptable." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but Bennett cut her off. "And don't you dare use Grace against me. Don't you dare suggest she wouldn't want me to be happy." Eleanor showed up at the cafe the next week, and Wren knew trouble was coming the moment she saw that expensive coat and those cold eyes. She served the tea Eleanor ordered and waited for the attack, and she didn't have to wait long. "You're the waitress my son has been wasting his time with, the one who thinks she can worm her way into a family fortune with a smile and a sad story." Wren's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "I'm not worming my way anywhere, Mrs. Crawford. Your son asked me to sit with him, and I said yes. That's the whole story." Eleanor leaned forward with a predator's smile. "He's vulnerable right now, and you're taking advantage. You're a waitress with empty pockets and big dreams, and we both know what you see when you look at him." "I see a man who loves his daughter and works too hard and forgot how to laugh," Wren said, and her voice was sharp now because she was tired of being underestimated. "I see someone who deserves to be happy, and I'm sorry if that doesn't fit whatever plan you had for his life." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but Wren wasn't finished. "I don't need saving, Mrs. Crawford. I've been saving myself my whole life, so whatever version of me you've invented in your head isn't the real one." But later that night alone in her tiny apartment, with the heat turned down to save money and instant noodles for dinner, Wren couldn't stop Eleanor's words from echoing in her head. She looked at the stack of bills on her counter, and the secondhand furniture, and the dreams that felt further away every year, and wondered if maybe the woman was right. What was she doing falling for a billionaire? What could she possibly offer him that he couldn't buy 1,000 times over? She started pulling back, canceling plans and keeping texts short and making excuses about extra shifts. And Bennett noticed immediately because he noticed everything about her now. He showed up at the cafe after closing and found her wiping down tables with red eyes and asked what happened because he knew something had changed and he needed to understand what. Wren told him about Eleanor, every word, every implication, every carefully placed doubt. Bennett's face went dark with anger, but Wren wasn't finished. "Look at me, Bennett. I'm a waitress who can barely make rent, and you're a CEO with a mansion and a legacy, and a mother who's right that I don't belong in your world." Bennett took her face in his hands and made her look at him. "You're making me feel alive again? That's what you're doing in my world." His voice was fierce and tender at the same time. "You see me, not my money or my name or what I can do for you. Just me. And I haven't felt seen like that since Grace died." Wren's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared, Bennett. I'm so scared this is too good to be real." He kissed her then, soft and certain, and Wren kissed him back with everything she'd been holding inside since Christmas Eve. Mrs. Penny dropped a tray somewhere behind them and started clapping. And Wren laughed against Bennett's lips, feeling for the first time like maybe she deserved this. Maybe fairy tales were real after all. Bennett drove straight from the cafe to his mother's mansion, with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, and his hands gripping the steering wheel like he was trying to strangle it. Eleanor was in her sitting room sipping tea, like she hadn't just tried to destroy the only good thing that had happened to him since Grace died. And when she looked up and saw his face, she had the audacity to look surprised. "You will apologize to Ren, or you will not be part of my life anymore." His voice was calm in a way that scared him because he meant every word, and there was no going back from this line in the sand. Eleanor set down her teacup with the precise movements of a woman who had never been challenged in her own home. "You can't be serious. She's a waitress, Bennett. She serves coffee for a living." Bennett stepped closer and let his mother see exactly how serious he was. "She held my daughter while she cried about her mother. She works 60 hours a week and still finds time to bake cookies with Nola. She sees me, not my money or my name or what I can do for her. And that's worth more than every trust fund baby you've tried to throw at me for the past 2 years." Eleanor opened her mouth, but Bennett wasn't finished. "Grace never cared about money either, and you disapproved of her too, and she won you over anyway because she was kind and real and loved me for exactly who I was." His voice cracked on his wife's name, but he pushed through. "Ren is the same. She's good and honest, and she makes Nola smile and she makes me smile. And I won't let you take that from us because it doesn't fit your vision of what a Crawford should want." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, longer than Bennett had ever seen her go without an opinion. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he expected. "Grace would have liked her." Bennett blinked because that was the last thing he'd anticipated. "She had that same fire, that same refusal to let me intimidate her, and I was wrong to treat this girl the way I treated your wife when you first brought her home." She stood and smoothed her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "I'll apologize. Not because you demanded it, but because I was wrong. And I'm woman enough to admit when I've made a mistake." Bennett didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, and Eleanor added quietly, "I just want you to be happy. I've watched you disappear into grief for 2 years, and I thought if I found the right person you'd come back to us. I didn't realize you'd already found her yourself." Eleanor showed up at the cafe the following week, and Ren's whole body tensed when she saw her walk through the door. But this time there was no attack, no thinly veiled insults, just a woman who looked smaller than she had before. "I owe you an apology, and I don't give those often, so I'd appreciate if you'd let me finish before responding." Ren waited with her arms crossed and her guard up. "I judged you by things that don't matter, and I said cruel things designed to drive you away from my son, and I was wrong on every count." Eleanor's voice was stiff, like the words cost her something to say. "Grace was a lot like you. She didn't come from money and she didn't care about status, and she loved Bennett for exactly who he was. And I made her life difficult for years before I finally admitted she was the best thing that ever happened to him." Ren felt some of her anger dissolve because she could hear the genuine regret underneath the formal words. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you probably know." Eleanor almost smiled. "He lights up when he talks about you. I haven't seen that since before the accident. And anyone who can bring my son back to life deserves better than what I gave you." She left without ordering anything, and Ren stood there feeling like she'd just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. The months that followed were the happiest Bennett could remember since before Grace died, filled with family dinners and movie nights, and Nola falling asleep between them on the couch like they'd always been a family. Ren taught Nola to bake, and Bennett taught Ren to play chess badly, and they all learned together what it meant to build something new without forgetting what came before. Bennett invested in Ren's bakery dream, not as charity but as a legitimate business opportunity because he'd seen her talent and believed in her vision. They opened a small shop attached to Mrs. Penny's cafe and called it Ren's Kitchen. And on opening day, Nola stood at the counter in a tiny apron handing out samples while Bennett watched the woman he loved see her dreams come true. 1 year to the day after they'd met, Bennett brought Ren and Nola back to Rosewood Cafe on Christmas Eve and requested table 7, the same table where a missed blind date had turned into the beginning of everything. The rose was there, and the candle was lit, and Nola was bouncing in her seat with barely contained excitement because she'd been practicing keeping a secret for 3 whole weeks, and she was about to explode. Ren looked around at the familiar cafe decorated for the holidays and felt tears prick her eyes because a year ago, she'd been counting her tips and wondering how she'd make rent, And now she had a business and a family and a man who looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. What's going on? Why are you both looking at me like that? Bennett stood up and took her hands, and she could feel him trembling, even though his voice was steady. 1 year ago, I walked into this cafe planning to skip another blind date because I was miserable and empty and convinced I'd never feel anything again. Wren's breath caught because she could hear where this was going. Then I met a waitress who taught my daughter about stars, who made me laugh, who saw me when I'd been invisible for 2 years. He reached into his pocket and dropped to one knee, and Nola squealed so loud that everyone in the cafe turned to look. Wren Holloway, you stole my heart in this cafe and gave me back my life. He opened the box to reveal a ring that sparkled in the candlelight. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Nola's mother and my partner in everything that comes next? Wren was crying and laughing and nodding all at once because words weren't working, but her heart was screaming yes louder than anything she'd ever felt. Yes, absolutely, yes, 1,000 times yes. And Bennett slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook while Nola launched herself at both of them, screaming about finally getting a mommy. The cafe erupted in applause, and Mrs. Penny was sobbing into her apron, saying she'd known from the very first night, and Eleanor was there somehow, clapping quietly in the corner with something that looked almost like genuine happiness on her face. Bennett kissed Wren while their daughter squeezed between them, and outside the snow fell soft and quiet, like it was blessing everything it touched. They got married in spring on a rooftop overlooking the city, with cherry blossoms drifting on the breeze and fairy lights strung between the pillars. Nola was the flower girl and took her responsibility so seriously that she practiced walking down the aisle 47 times the week before. Eleanor sat in the front row actually smiling, and Mrs. Penny catered the whole thing herself because she refused to let anyone else feed her kids on their wedding day. Bennett's vows made everyone cry, including himself. You taught me that love isn't about deserving it. It's about showing up every day and choosing each other even when it's hard. Wren's vows made everyone cry harder. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. You gave me a family I never thought I'd have. They kissed while Nola cheered, and the setting sun painted everything gold. 2 years later, on Christmas Eve, the family sat in their living room decorating the tree while snow fell outside and carols played softly from the speaker in the corner. Nola was carefully hanging ornaments she'd made herself while Bennett held Wren close on the couch, his hand resting gently on her very pregnant belly. Daddy, tell me the story again, how you met Mommy, Nola demanded, and Bennett smiled at Wren before beginning. Well, I was supposed to meet a boring lady for dinner, but she didn't show up. Nola bounced excitedly. And instead you met Mommy and she told me about the stars. Wren laughed and pulled her daughter close. And you were the best thing that ever happened to all of us. Sometimes the dates you try to skip lead you exactly where you're supposed to be. Bennett walked into that cafe planning to avoid another blind date and found the love of his life instead. Wren was just trying to survive another Christmas Eve alone and found a family she never knew she needed. If this story reminded you that love finds you in the smallest moments and that the right person sees you when you feel invisible, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to believe their fairy tale is still coming. Merry Christmas, and thank you for being here with us.